Very good morning to everyone. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today on a Saturday morning and giving us the time. My name is Sandhya and I'm the program manager at Mongabay India. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce my friend and colleague, Mr. Gopi Krishna Warrior. I'm sure for most of you in the audience, Gopi doesn't need an introduction, but I will spend a couple of minutes highlighting why Gopi is one of the best suited journalists to talk on biodiversity reporting from an India perspective. Over a long career spanning more than 35 years, Gopi has worn different hats in the environmental communication field. He started his career with two national level environment and development NGOs, Action for Food Production or AFPRO, and the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, that is INTAC. For a decade, starting in 1992, he was an environmental journalist in Chennai with the Down to Earth magazine, firstly, for which he was the first South India correspondent, and then with the Hindu Business Line newspaper. He has since worked with the communication departments of two international agricultural research organizations, the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, or ICRISAT, based at Hyderabad, and the Africa Rice Center at Cotonou in Benin in West Africa. As the regional environmental manager for PANOS South Asia, he has worked with the media in Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka to enhance journalists' understanding of climate change and biodiversity. As a freelancer, he has written for multiple publications, most notably the India Climate Dialogue, Nature India, Frontline, and News Minute. Now, as a managing editor at Mongabay India, he's the editorial lead, ensuring that our ship sails in the right direction. He has been an invaluable mentor to numerous journalists across South Asia, including India. And today we have a wonderful opportunity to listen to him share his learnings that have sort of crystallized over so many years of experience. Before I hand over to Gopi, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. You're welcome to ask questions, but please drop them in the question and answer box, which is in the bottom bar of your Zoom next to the chat box. We'll monitor the questions and have a discussion after Gopi finishes his presentation. Keep an eye on the chat box as well. The team will be sending relevant links during the presentation. Thank you so much. Welcome again. And Gopi, over to you.
Thank you, Sandhya. Thank you. Good morning to everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here this morning to talk about how biodiversity has progressed, biodiversity conservation policy, conservation action has progressed in India in connection with how it has been progressing outside the country, and how it can be linked to our local action. And ultimately, what is most important, what we as ordinary journalists can do to conserve biodiversity and bring it into the mainstream of national discussions. So if you will bear with me, I'll just start my presentation. Give me a second. Can you see the screen? Can somebody in my team confirm?
Yes, Gopi, we can see.
Yeah. See this. Okay, perfect. So I call this the Rio to Bangalore. I mean, actually, the long headline when I was starting to write it was from Rio to Delhi to Chennai to Bangalore. But then I thought that's too much of a trip for all of you to take, and too much of a trip for me to take. I mean, I like taking trips, but then I don't have a right to take you in a trip. So so I reduced it from Rio to Bangalore. Now the significance is linking the why. I mean Bangalore, because we did a project there. I'll tell you about the project, reporting project there. So I'll tell you about that. But linking Bangalore to Rio de Janeiro, where the Earth Summit or the Rio Summit or UNCED happened in 1992. So from there, and on the way, Delhi, where the national policies were designed. Chennai, not so much because I spent more than 2.5 decades in the city, but basically because the National Biodiversity Authority is there. So good amount of biodiversity action happens in Chennai. So and the second part is, why should we report on urban biodiversity? Actually, it's not just why should we report on urban biodiversity. I mean, that'll be the first part, and you will notice that I will also be talking about how we should be reporting on biodiversity. So that's this from an old journalist who has been in this line for quite some time, to all of you, younger and far more active journalists in the field. So first of all, welcome and thank you for joining this morning. This is your session. So join me on the trip. Now let me set the context. The context is the project we had in collaboration with Citizen Matters, MongoDB India and Citizen Matters. This was part of a Bangalore Sustainability Forum project, and this was to report on Bangaluru's urban biodiversity. So Citizen Matters, as you know, who all of you who have been following Citizen Matters, Citizen Matters' strength is in urban reporting. They do a lot of fabulous work from Bangalore and Chennai. Our focus is mostly national, and we hadn't done too much of urban biodiversity reporting. We had done more of rural and landscape level reporting. So this opportunity gave us a wonderful opportunity to work together and bring out some very path-breaking stories, and these were done by a team of very good authors. I mean, people like Mohit Rao, Arti Kumar Rao, Arti Menon, Bhanu Sridharan, Apekshita Vashne. So give a big hand of applause to them. And I'll come back to the stories in more detail later. But our stories looked at agriculture biodiversity and EIA process, and how loss affects livelihoods and species like the bee pollinators or slender loris and Hasargata grasslands, the wetlands, etc. So we looked at ecosystems, we looked at species, we looked at systems. So we'll come to the stories slightly later in detail. Now, every story, I mean, if you remember all the stories that we start, I mean, whenever we have read stories right from a childhood, they start with once upon a time. So let me take you to the once upon a time movement in my presentation, because this also is a story. So let's step back 30 years, 1991. That's when a fairly major milestone happened in India. I'm saying this without any value judgment, good or bad. I mean, that's for us to look at and analyze it from our perspectives. But 1991 is where India launched the economic reforms. So the three main principles were liberalizing the economy, privatizing the economy, especially the industrial sector. Much of it was focused on the industrial sector, and globalizing the industrial sector, so getting foreign players to come and invest in Indian industry. But the most important was that there was an increased focus on middle class to consume domestically produced goods and services. Now, this was important because for any economy to grow, I mean, you can kickstart an economy by starting with exports, but then that is not something that's going to sustain economic growth over a long time. What you need to do is you need to have domestic consumption, and it's only domestic consumption that can grow an economy. And domestic consumption of goods and services can happen only if you identify a group of people who are the likely consumers, and focus on them so that you increase their desire to consume. Now, this was especially important for India because for people like me who were born in the 60s, grew up in 70s, and maybe even some of you who can relate, you can relate to your parents' generation. I mean, we were more of savers rather than spenders. I mean, our parents focus more on saving rather than spending. And now saving is good, but then that doesn't push the economy. So there was an increased focus from 1991 on the middle class. So what was Indian middle class? What is the number? These are debated concepts. Pink newspapers, white newspapers, business newspapers at that time said India had a middle class of 250 million to 300 million. I mean, that we know was hyperbole. I mean, it's not that much, but still, they said India had a middle class, and they said our middle class itself is as big as the US population or the West European population. So the focus was on increasing consumption. The second major milestone or the second pillar on which I'm going to build my story is the Convention on Biological Diversity. This was one of the three actually, but technically two because the third one came slightly later. The conventions that came out of the Rio Summit of 1992. So the other one being the Climate Change Convention, and the third one, which came slightly later but still considered as part of the group, is the Convention to Combat Desertification. So the 1992, the milestone and the pillar for this was the Convention on Biological Diversity. So what it did, I mean, let's look at the main features of the Convention on Biological Diversity. One was it declared biological diversity along with the traditional knowledge associated with the use of biological diversity and traditional knowledge to be sovereign property, so that it belongs to the country where it originates. Now, this was a major paradigm shift. Before that, biodiversity was considered as a global commons. That's how international agriculture research institutes collected the initial germ plasm, the gene banks, and so it was a global commons. So the major paradigm shift was biodiversity became a sovereign property. And then the third threefold objective of the CBD. One was conservation of biological diversity, conserve biological diversity and associated traditional knowledge, because biodiversity without the traditional knowledge is of no use. So, I mean, haldi is of no use without the traditional knowledge of how haldi can be used. So biodiversity and traditional knowledge. It's sustainable use so that, you don't destroy haldi all at once, sustainable use so that mankind can continue to use haldi all through. And third, most important, the equitable sharing of benefits. So people who have been conserving the biological diversity, they must get benefit of what comes out of monetizing it or commercializing it. So equitable sharing of benefit. And the last thing was, I mean, like Climate Change Convention and the other convention, the CBD also was a framework convention. Framework convention meaning that countries went through a two-stage process. First they signed and then they ratified it. This two-stage process was to make it sustainable over a long period. So the government, the minister, in our case, it was the environment minister who attended, signed the document, and then the parliament had to ratify it, had to endorse it, so that if even after the government changes, the country is agreeable to, committed to the Convention of Biological Diversity. So it's a framework convention. It was signed and ratified by India, but as a framework convention, it's like a guideline. So it had to be sort of brought into purpose, brought into action only through country legislation. So we will take a look at how India proceeded with its legislation slightly later. And in 1992, the other third pillar was the 73rd and the 74th Amendment of the Constitution, of the Indian Constitution. So this was again a very landmark amendment where Indian Constitution was where devolution of power was devolved, power was decentralized, and power was also handed over to a three-tier mechanism, both in the urban side and in the rural side. So the three-tier mechanism was Zilla Parishad, Gram Panchayat, and the village panchayat in the rural side, and similar structure, the corporation, the local self-government, and the slightly larger thing, and the Zilla Parishad in the urban side. So three-tier structure in urban and district block, and basically confining the district block and the local body level. And each state was to create its own act. So it was a central act. I mean, it was a central amendment, but then to make it active, each state had to create its own act. So different states had different speeds, different states had different alacrity to do it. Different states design the acts with different levels of effectiveness. But almost all states by end of the 1990s, Tamil Nadu was perhaps the last. I mean, Kerala was amongst the earliest and best, amongst the best implemented Panchayats Act. And by end of 1990s, almost all states had the Panchayats Act. Now, these are the three pillars I'm going to talk to you about. Now, what changed in July 1991? I mean, why was the economic reforms needed? I mean, it was a response to a balance of payment crisis. I mean, you may have read about it, how we almost had to, forfeit had to pledge our gold. And the response was that to devalue the rupee so that, our exports become more attractive in the foreign market. And new industrial policy, which was the most important thing, the new industrial policy, because the entire liberalization process was focused towards industry, the industrial sector. So liberalization, privatization, globalization, overhauling of the export-import policy, push for export promotion. So it started off with pushing export promotion industries, etc., export-based, like you would have heard stories about, leather, increasing leather exports, increasing textile exports, increasing gem exports, etc., etc. And then strengthening of the capital market so that people could invest in companies, private companies, and reduction in government subsidies. So this was the kind of action plan that happened in 1991. Now, all this has an impact on biodiversity. We'll come to that. And the big transition was consumer became king. I mean, as we mentioned, the consumer became king. Middle class became consumer became king. So house, car, personal loans at reduced interest rates. So for some of you of the younger generation, I suppose your first vehicle perhaps is a car. I mean, for somebody of my generation, certainly it was not my first vehicle. I mean, I had a scooter for a very, very long time till I could afford to buy a second-hand car, with a lot of planning. And for my father's generation, many families didn't have a car because they couldn't afford to buy a car. So, that's the kind of change that happened. And people felt that world was in their hands, mobile phones, computer, internet, low-cost air travel. So, I mean, now you think your second cousin's third relative is getting married, you can fly, which was impossible. I mean, we travel in young days by ordinary sleeper class train, and train travel took 2 to 3 days to reach somewhere, and so travel had to be planned. So that stock markets gave him a sense of ownership in the private sector. I mean, so you felt you owned the economy, and most important, and this is something which we'll come back to, and this is of great significance in biodiversity discussions. This thing called the plastic water bottles, losing connect with the ecological footprint. Today, I do not care where the water is coming from, the water I drink is coming from, as long as I have access to a plastic water bottle at 15 rupees or so. I mean, 15 rupees is not too difficult for me to spend. I mean, as long as I can spend that and I can get the water, I don't care what is the ecological cost at the location where water is being drawn. And I drink the water, I discard the bottle, and I do not care what route my bottle takes to its grave. So I do not care about the ecological footprint. And this is something very, very important that we will see. Uh, Economic voice led to political voice. So it was not just economic voice. I mean, and we saw that happening at the beginning of the last decade. We had this, which started with the in Delhi, the Ramlila grounds, the Anna Hazare's fast, which brought urban middle classes into a political melting pot, and later the 2014 victory, where the middle class played quite a role. So this was the voice of aspiration, growth, development, and nationalism. And you saw it. I mean, you saw it in the first budget that Arun Jaitley presented, then Finance Minister Arun Jaitley presented. He talked about, you'll hear about Rurban, Rurban. I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right, Rurban, which is rural urban. So it was linking the rural aspiration to be urban. So that's what it was. But the good side, or the flip side of this, is this is the same voice which has the strength to, if it wants to conserve biodiversity, this is the voice that can leverage impact on policy. So in that sense, it raised the urban middle class voice. And we also noticed that the cities grew in the last 30 years since liberalization. If you look at the first one here, you will see that for every one person going into a growing, in the 1% growth in 1 person's growth in population in rural areas between 2001 and 2011. Unfortunately, we don't have the 2021 data yet. There was a 1 person growing in moving to a city. And if you look at the larger picture of population growth between 1991 and 2001 and 2011, you'll realize the rural area population growth diminished by close to 6%, whereas the urban area population growth grew by close to 0.5%. So India has been urbanizing the past 30 years. So almost every 1 in 2 people added were in the urban cities. Now the push and pull factors. I mean, what made the cities grow in these last few decades of urbanization? So after what India did was to follow, and that was the purpose, was to follow the policy of growth of growth that was followed by developed countries. So that's a classical paradigm. So you have the 3 sectors of the economy. You have the agriculture sector, which is the primary sector of the economy. Secondary sector of the economy is the manufacturing sector, and the third sector is the tertiary sector, is the service sector. So I mean, under the classic pattern of economic growth, a country becomes developed. As a country becomes developed, it's the share of agriculture in the GDP comes down, and the share of manufacturing, and finally the tertiary sector, service sector, grows. So that is the pathway which India also took. Now, economic reforms were for the industrial sector. So we have said that before. The economic reforms were for the industrial sector, and it meant that more industrial estates close to large cities grew. So there were a lot of industrial clusters growing close to large industries. So those of you from Pune would know that there's a whole deal of car manufacturing companies near Pune. Those of you from Chennai know that there's a whole deal of not just car companies. I mean, Hyundai and Ford are there. Ford may not be there after some time, but then Hyundai and Ford are there. And in addition, whole series of ancillary industries, people who make this, people who make dashboards, people who make bumpers, people who make drivetrains, So whole series of ancillary units are there. So that gave the first push to the cities, urban growth. And it was later in the 1990s that national government, and if I remember correctly, it was at the time of Yashwant Sinha as the finance minister and Atal Bihari Vajpayee as the prime minister, that there was a clear focus on ICE, the information, communication, and entertainment industries, ICE sector. And that's when even state government started promoting support for IT and ITES, that is information technology and information technology enabled services industries. So we had places like the Cyberabad in Hyderabad coming, and that entire area growing, Gachibowli, that Medipatnam, that entire area growing after that, and at the end of close to 99, 2000. And in Chennai, you had the tidal park coming at around 2000, in around the year 2000. And the entire thing that you see, OMR and, all that has come, satellite townships have come later. Bangalore led the pack, followed by Hyderabad, Chennai, and a host of second-tier cities. So whole lot of second-tier cities also urbanized and saw growth, Pune, Ahmedabad, Indore, Kochi, Trivandrum, a whole range of second-tier cities saw the growth. And then third tier of cities like the city that I am in, Thrissur, which is not, it's not an IT-led growth, but then it is part of the larger urbanization growth. So whole set of cities grew with this in this urbanization process. But there was a cost to urbanization, and just to give you an example, there's a beautiful work done by Kera Trust, animated maps. They've developed animated maps of Chennai, blue and red maps. So blue stands for the wetlands in Chennai, and red stands for the built-up areas in Chennai. So just take a look at this map and how it has changed over the years. So it starts with 1980 and ends in 2010. Have a look at this video. Oops, sorry. Excuse me, sorry, apologies. Have a look at this. I'll show it again. It's, if you talk, if you see it quick, it's so quick that it moves. I'll just show it again. Give me a second. Okay, let's move on then. Now there was urban environmentalism too. So the map that we saw of Chennai, that's true for any city. So any organization which has put together time-lapse maps like this would show almost every city had a growth pattern like this. But there was a good side of that too. There was a certain amount of environmentalism happening in this new urban crowd, So what happened? These cities became centers of multiple cultures and changed the demographics of these cities. So Bengaluru today, has people from any part, any part of the country. Any part of the country, and maybe even from neighboring countries too, or other countries too, So these cities became a melting pot of multiple cultures, and that changed the demographics of the cities. You will meet old timers who will say, oh, the city has changed. That's basically because the demographics of the city has changed. And mostly young people, because the growth was in the IT sector, and IT sector needed young people. And as it is, India's demographic profile is young today. More than half of the population is young. So people who migrated to the city were young people. And there was, they all, people had good jobs, had free time on Saturday and Sunday, had reasonably decent money in their hands, but they felt that they were part of a cog in the wheel. So they wanted to give something back to the society, and that's where all these neighborhood cleanup, planting drives, citizen science, and many other green initiatives evolved in these urban environments. Now let's go to biodiversity. I mean, let's just go to the second pillar of biodiversity. What is biodiversity? I mean, we just need to define it, because this is what the Convention on Biological Diversity says. But it means the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species and between species and of ecosystems. So diversities of species, within species, and of ecosystems. All this constitutes biological diversity. And we know of agriculture biodiversity. This is a story my colleague Sahana had done. And I mean, much of our food systems today, what crops we eat, has come from the agriculture biodiversity. So natural biodiversity, which also consists of agriculture biodiversity. There is this explanation about biological hotspots, and India, interestingly, has 3 of the biological hotspots. So these are the hotspots where there's rich biological diversity and are threatened by human activity. So you have number 21, that's the Western Ghats, where I mean, close to which Bangalore is located, and you have Eastern Himalayas, that is number 32, and the Indo-Burma, which is northeast of India and running all the way down to Thailand and Malaysia, etc. So we have these 3 spots of three ecological hotspots within India. And let's go back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This was one of the earliest documents on global documents on biodiversity. It says that the current time that we are going through is a period of extinctions. I mean, we are going through a period of extinction. So if you look at the old period, distant past, for fossil records, for every 1,000 mammal species, less than 1 went extinct every millennium. So of every 1,000, 1 went extinct every millennium. So 1 went extinct in 1,000 years. And then you go to the current one. The current extinction rate is up to 1,000 times higher than the fossil record. So if 1 went extinct over 1,000 years in the fossil records, 1,000 go extinct in the current period. And then if you go to the future, will be 10 times higher than the current rate. So we are talking about 10,000 species going extinct every 1,000 years. And the danger is many of these species have not even been recorded by science, and so there could be species which could go extinct even before science records it. This is the most important. I mean, and this is something which we sometimes forget, we do not understand, or we take it for granted, of what are the ecosystem services that biodiversity gives us. It gives us supporting nutrient cycle, soil formation. It gives us food, fresh water. Gives us climate regulation. So even you go into any area with any wooded area, it'll be 2 degrees cooler than even in deep summer. If you walk into IIC campus, I'm sure it's 2 degrees cooler than what it's outside. It gives us cultural, aesthetic, spiritual, education, recreation, and gives us a sense of security, basic food material for good life, health, good social relations, freedom of choice and action. So ecosystem services is what we get from biodiversity. And biodiversity is, I mean, conserving biodiversity is, or the risk of not conserving biodiversity is also very, very strong economically. So if you look at the late 2020 report, this 2020 report from the World Economic Forum, and World Economic Forum, which is also called the Davos Forum, is the primary body where all the big industrialists of the world meet. And if you look at this report, it looks at biodiversity loss. So on the x-axis is the likelihood of risk happening, and the y-axis is the impact of the risk. So if you look at biodiversity loss here, 2020, it's only less than climate action failure. That is, if we mess up our climate negotiations and the climate action, or the risk of extreme weather events. Extreme weather events being floods, droughts, etc. So there is a very, very strong risk of economic risk of not taking care of biodiversity. What did the world do after the CBD? I mean, that's a question we need to ask. I mean, what happened? It was in 1992, and then what happened globally after that? There have been conference of parties every year, not every year, sorry, once in 2 years, unlike the climate change convention COPs, which happen every year. These are lesser known. I mean, in India, we journalists reported about the CBD COP in 2012. That's because it was hosted in Hyderabad. But otherwise, world over, and certainly so in India too, the CBDs are less reported. CBD COPs are less reported than the climate change COPs being conference of parties. So where all the parties who have signed the convention come together once every 2 years to take the discussions forward. So there was one which was supposed to have happened in Kunming, China last year, and that got postponed, and that is scheduled to happen again in Kunming, China in October. So that's the next one that's happening. Then there was this, the biodiversity convention is a broader, legal agreement. But under that, you have protocols being the smaller agreements for a very specific purpose. So all of you have covered climate change. We talk about the Kyoto Protocol, etc. So likewise, there was a Cartagena. I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right. Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. It was to regulate the living modding, use the precautionary principle for preventing, accidental problems due to living modified organisms. So that was the Cartagena Protocol. Then there was another protocol which came in 2010. That's a Nagoya Protocol, which is of importance because it is on access and benefit sharing. So the third principle of Biodiversity Convention, equitable benefit sharing. This is on access and benefit sharing. Then there was this Aichi biodiversity target, which was part of the strategic plan for 2011 to 2020, and this had 20 targets, and this got over last year, and now there is this new target that's coming. I'll talk about that, and then the body called IPBES, that is Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. This was created in 2012, and discussions were started about it in 2010, and then 2012 it was created. So this is like the IPCC. It's equivalent to what the IPCC is in climate change negotiations. But the difference is IPCC came into being in 1988. That is 4 years before the climate change convention happened, whereas IPBES came to being in 2012. That is 20 years after the Convention on Biological Diversity. And currently the process is on for finalizing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We will just take a quick look at what the Global Biodiversity Framework, because this is the latest that is being discussed internationally. This is the current discussions internationally on biodiversity conservation. So this is a work in progress. The first draft was released on 5 July 2021. People are still talking and negotiating this, and hopefully by the Kunming meeting, there may be an improved draft. Whether it be the final draft, I do not know, but there would be an improved draft, or this may change or may not change. But this is the first draft, and so what it does is it admits that despite some progress, none of the 20 targets that were set for the Aichi targets were met. None of them were met. So this was not they're reflecting what the Global Biodiversity Outlook said in 2019. That's a 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook, and also what the IPBES report said. So none of the targets were met. So now the question that you could ask, and the question that we could ask, and the question that the international community could ask, that if Aichi targets were not met. What is the point? I mean, what's the point? I mean, would the global biodiversity framework be met? But then the point is, people are looking at developing a framework for 2030. Now, this one takes the time frame in two steps. One is the vision for 2015. Vision is up to 2015, but the mission action is going to be up for 2030. So the vision is by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used. Maintaining ecosystem services, that is, ecosystem services are maintained, sustaining a healthy planet and delivering benefits essential for all people. This is the vision. And the mission is to take urgent action across society to conserve and sustainably use biodiversity and ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources, to put biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030. That is what it's saying, to put a biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030 for the benefit of planet and people. So this is the vision and mission for that. And it talks about 4 goals for 2050. And the milestones are for 2030. So I'm not going into the milestones here because I will talk about the about the action plan. So the goal is up to 2050, the integrity of all ecosystem is enhanced, and 15% of the area, at least an increase of 15% in the area connectivity and integrity of all natural ecosystems. Increase in 15% in area of all natural ecosystems, so that connectivity is enhanced. Rate of extinctions reduced tenfold, and risk of species extinction is halved. So rate of extinctions is reduced, and species extinction rate is risk of species extinction is reduced to half. Genetic diversity of wild and domesticated species is safeguarded. The diversity is safeguarded with at least 90% of genetic diversity within all species maintained. Goal B is nature's contribution to people are valued, maintained, or enhanced through conservation and sustainable use, supporting the global development agenda for the benefit of all. So nature's contributions to people are valued, maintained, or enhanced through conservation and sustainable use. Goal C is the benefits from the utilization of genetic resources, very important. Benefits from the utilization are shared fairly and equitably without a substantial increase in both monetary benefits, with a substantial increase, in both monetary and non-monetary benefit, including conservation, sustainable use of biodiversity, and the gap between available financial and other means of implementation, which is most important. This is where most of discussions get stuck. You can talk all big things, but then when it comes to money, it sort of gets stuck. So gap is closed. And the framework says 21 targets, at least 30% of the land area is conserved, 50% greater reduction rate of introduction of invasive alien species, reducing nutrient loss, that is loss from the soil nutrients, etc., by 2/3. Nature-based contributions to global climate change mitigation efforts, that is through green missions, etc. Redirecting, repurposing, reforming, eliminating insect. This is what you call the regressive subsidies. Just equal way, reducing the regressive subsidies and increasing the good subsidies, and a $200 billion increase in international financial flows. We will come to all this later. In India, how did we proceed with the biodiversity bill? We started. India started talking about biodiversity in the early 1990s itself, after the CBD was signed. By 1996-97, a high-powered committee was constituted. That is MS Swaminathan committee that was constituted to draft the legislation. A draft legislation was ready by mid-2020 and then mid-2000. And you see this editorial in the Hindu Business Line of that time on the biodiversity bill. The Biodiversity Act was passed by Parliament in 2002 and got the President's assent in February 2003. National Biodiversity Authority was established in Chennai. And as of now, there are 29 state biodiversity board, 6 union territory councils, and upwards of 270,000 biodiversity management committees. So we have 270,000 biodiversity management committees. And these are at the local self-government level. And there were many public discussions in proceeding to the Biodiversity Act. So a lot of public discussion. As a young reporter, I was covering most of it, and because many of it was happening in Chennai, and then because Chennai was a nerve center, and I was covering this. So a lot of public discussions happening. Parliamentary committee going and meeting people. So a whole lot of public discussions happened. And there were these national biodiversity targets the government had set. I mean, this is available in the NBA website. So basically awareness increase, sustainable agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. But the big thing was the irony of public perception, and this is what is important for us journalists. Both the conventions came at the same time: 1992 climate change, Convention on Biological Diversity, and Convention on Climate Change. India took, as a country, India took a strong position, rhetorical position against, trying to protect the equity, that is the equity argument in the international fora on climate change. And that started from 1992 onwards. But within the country, action plan was much delayed. The first action plan that happened was in 2008 when Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, and he started the Prime Minister's Council on climate change. And then all kinds of things are happening now. And interestingly, biodiversity was different. I mean, biodiversity, as I said, we had a lot of public discussions. We had, we were the earliest, among the earliest countries to have a legislation. We had a National Biodiversity Authority. We had the entire institutional framework established. But the irony is not that. The irony is, despite the fact that we were early movers in biodiversity, there's hardly any public discussions on biodiversity, whereas there's a lot of public discussion on climate change. So this is something that we journalists have to keep in mind. And there was another irony also, and this irony is with the third pillar of the building that I was talking about, the story that I was talking about. The devolution of power to local bodies was fairly complete when it comes to the rural local bodies. So a panchayat gets the power it requires to act, a gram panchayat. Whereas to the urban bodies, a mayor or a corporation does not get the same kind of powers that it's required to act. That's basically because a whole lot of these bodies, the powers are divided not just with the corporation, but with parastatal bodies, like the Madras Metro Water Board. So there are slum clearance boards, there are, sewage boards, there are, some other boards. And then if you have a metropolitan transport system, then you have a body, CMRL, DMRL, BMRL, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole series of parastatal bodies. So the corporations do not have the same powers that their counterparts in the villages or gram panchayats have. Now, and because of this, urban citizens may not be able to hold their elected representative responsible for biodiversity loss. So that is very, very important. They may not have the kind of they may not have the powers to do things, even if we hold them responsible. What are the stories we did? And we're coming back to the stories and how we sort of looked at these stories from Bangalore on Bangalore biodiversity. There was a story on slender loris. Mohit Rao did it. And the lesson we learned from that was, despite steady destruction of habitat of a small number of slender loris is still there, still there. But they're finding it difficult. So something like the slender loris, which requires a very, very unique kind of canopy cover to survive, that's still there, but they're finding it difficult. Hesagata West grasslands, Aarti Menon did this very nice story. And then she said the grasslands around Hesagata Lake packs a very, very rich biodiversity, which is not understood. And it's almost considered as a wasted land by policymakers. And they have plans to develop all kinds of things, including a film city. And Aarti Kumar Rao did this very interesting story on this solitary bees. Solitary bees are not the bees that we usually talk about. These are not the hive bees, but solitary bees. And there are far more solitary bee species than we realize in the city. And increased heat island effect, because as the city grows, the city becomes, it traps more heat. The heat island can have different impact on different species. There are some species of bees which like the heat and they will do well, and some species of bees that don't like the heat and maybe they may not do as well. And a revival and absence of Bangaluru's traditional crop varieties, Apekshita Varshini did this story. And it was this green revolution, urbanization. There's a loss of the traditional crops, that is millets, gourds, and legumes. And there are some efforts to bring them back. Katte and Kunte, Mohit Rao did the story on how the, and like the story from Chennai, how the cascading network of wetlands are being eaten up by urbanization. And Vimal did this very interesting story on how artificial light is sort of, I mean, we can switch off our lights, but then, what about the creatures of the night and what impact it has on their reproduction, on their foraging habits, on their survival. So this is a very interesting story because city lights don't shut off at all nowadays. And Bhanu did a detailed story which was carried as one piece in Mogabe India and 3 pieces in Citizen Matters on how EIAs are big for urban construction. This housing construction is a bit of a sham, and another important story was by Apekshita, who looked at biodiversity management, how BMC is back. The Biodiversity Management Committee of Bangalore is back, but still the PBR, that is People's Biodiversity Register, that was created years ago, is still under wraps. So what is the point? So that's a question that that Apekshita has asked in her story. So these are the lessons we learned from these stories. Now coming to what can we do? I mean, we are after all just a small part of the larger cog of society, but whether our importance is increasing or decreasing, I don't want to go into that discussion. That's a very very long discussion. But what can we do to mainstream biodiversity? We have to communicate more about the ecosystem services, because somewhere we lose this connect. The society, especially urban society, because urban centers are centers of consumption. Urban centers are not centers of primary production. I mean, they could be centers of tertiary production. That is, they could be generating wealth in terms of IT companies, or just outside urban centers, you could have industrial estates, which could be generating wealth out of manufacturing. But urban centers are not centers of primary consumption. Usually they get all their food and resources, natural resources from outside. So communicate about the ecosystem services from biodiversity. I mean, so why it is important to maintain, what little green that is there, what little blue that is there, what do we get? I mean, everything cannot be put down to money, because everything cannot be put down to money, but then communicate the ecosystem services. I mean, what pleasure it has if you go and sit next to a water body, clean water body. So communicate the ecosystem services from biodiversity, the pollination services. If the plants are not there, I mean, if the pollinators are not there, we may not be having food. So, pollination services, etc., ecosystem services. Articulate how biodiversity is connected to everything else. This is very important. I mean, the mainstreaming the biodiversity. I mean, how biodiversity is linked to everything else in nature and in the economy and the society. The National Biodiversity Authority did an assessment where it looked at which all ministries is biodiversity related to, and then it sort of came with the conclusion that almost every ministry has some linkage to biodiversity. So every ministry's activity has some linkage to biodiversity. So articulate how biodiversity is mainstreamed into the economy, into the system. Report consistently about ecological footprints, which is very important, because we lose in our day-to-day existence, our readers, our viewers, our listeners lose track, and we ourselves lose track of the ecological footprints of our actions. So report consistently about the ecological footprint, follow environmental economic stories on economic opportunities to conservation. This is an area which is growing more in the recent decades. So if you have heard of something called the TEEB is an international process called the economics of ecosystem and biodiversity. So this whole thing started with the growth in the environmental economics sphere, and looking at trying to find economic value of biological diversity that is there. And once you can put an economic value to keeping a biological diversity, then it becomes easier for policymakers to take a decision to conserve. Because right now, the conventional economics looks at the opportunity cost of using the biodiversity. So the point is, if a dam were to come where a forest is, the opportunity, I mean, if the economics that goes to the policymaker is, if this dam comes, it will help the state with X, Y, Z megawatts of energy, gigawatts of energy. It will help the industries grow, etc., etc. So that economic calculation is done, but nobody has done the economic calculation of what is the ecosystem services and what are the environmental services that come out of the forests that will be destroyed. So the economics, the environmental economics field, but this field is relatively younger, working on reports such as the TEEB, which looks at what is the economic cost, I mean, economics opportunity of value of that forest. So if that value can be proved through rigorous economics to be higher than what benefit that can come, economic benefit that can come from from submerging it and making a dam, then it's easier for the policymaker to take a decision to say, yes, I'll conserve this patch of forest. So that those kind of environmental economic stories is something that we must pursue to look at the opportunities, economic opportunities for conservation. And there is nothing like wasted lands. I mean, we have known it from many of our stories. I mean, there's nothing like wasted lands. I mean, when the upper reaches of Nilgiris, when people started moving there and they saw acres and acres of grasslands, they said it's wasted lands. Let's convert it to eucalyptus plantation, acacia plantations. One, it can help firewood needs. Two, it can supply pulpwood for rayon industry, paper industry, etc. But then the grasslands are not wasted lands. Now, grasslands are not wasted lands, not just in the upper reaches of Nilgiris, but also in the Hesagata grassland. That's not wasted lands. I mean, there is an ecological purpose out of that, and there's ecological service coming out of those grasslands. So there's nothing like wasted lands in nature. Celebrate the lesser known conservation, very, very important in our line of work, because we celebrate the big people, but let's celebrate the lesser known conservationists. For those of you who have been following Mongabay India, take a look at our series called Wetland Champions. My colleague Aditi Tandon coordinated that series, and there we looked at small, people ordinary people, like a shepherd in Mandya, or women's group in Vellore, or a monk in Tawang. Ordinary people who have who were doing it out of their own personal drive. They work to conserve wetlands across the country. So celebrate the lesser known conservation is very important. I mean, something that we should not forget in our way of reporting, and articulate the linkages between biodiversity and Edwards impact during extreme weather events. So now these kind of stories are now becoming serious, because in 2015, I mean, there were, for donkey's years, there were people like the Kera Trust or even journalists, environment journalists, and we were laughed at, at those times when we said, don't build over the Pallikarni marsh. It'll flood. But in 2015, when the city flooded, then that's when we that's when the city realized that Palikarne marsh is so important for the drainage of the city, So it could have drained the water out when it flooded. So articulate the linkages. These are the opportunities where we can bring out the linkages. 4 hours of rain on August 15th, 2017, 120 millimeters of rainfall, Bangalore flooded. Now, I mean, it's not as if 120 millimeters had not come earlier. It's just that now that we have done away with our biodiversity network, this becomes a big thing. And when you hit at this time, in the sense that when you write a story at this time, people start understanding the linkages between biodiversity and adverse impact. The mangroves of Mumbai and their relationship to floods, Miti River, etc. So all these are, we have to continue articulating that. And let us talk about payment for ecosystem services. I mean, this is the truism. The truism in biodiversity is those who conserve, the communities who conserve biological diversity are not necessarily rich because of the biodiversity. I mean, not necessarily economically rich because of the biodiversity. I mean, they have stayed poor, but still they have conserved biological diversity. So, like the Kani tribes of Ashtamudi, of Agasthyamala Hills, I mean, they live in biologically rich area, but they have not monetized it, And because they have not monetized it, we have that biodiversity left for us. So we must insist on payment for ecosystem services stories. I mean, stories. So if there is something happening where somebody has conserved biodiversity, I mean, if somebody has conserved, despite all kinds of pressure, conserved to hold a piece of ancestral land that he has got in the city of Bangalore and conserved it with good trees, then there must be some kind of a payment system for that person. So payment of ecosystem services we must talk about in our story. So these are some of the hows that we can do, and where are we going to get important information for doing our stories on biodiversity, urban biodiversity especially. Our fellow journalist and person who wrote good stories for this series, Bhanu Sridharan, has done a wonderful wonderful book called A Manual for Journalists on Reporting Urban Biodiversity. It talks mostly from Bangalore's viewpoint, but then it connects to all urban cities, good for all urban cities. You can download I think the link would be on your screen on the chat box. So you can download this, you can bookmark it and download it. And I recommend that you should have a copy of this with you. And Bhanu also did, for this part of the same project, Bhanu did a thing on reporters. I mean, this one was for journalists. Second one is for scientists. How can scientists communicate about biodiversity to journalists? Just helping scientists to understand what journalists want, because way scientists communicate and way journalists communicate are different. Just helping in that, building bridges. So I would recommend all the scientist friends who are here in this meeting, please do bookmark this and download it. And some of the other biodiversity listings. There's this international biodiversity listing called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. It's like almost like a UN body, which sort of does international. It's got millions of species registered and listed. Global Biodiversity Information Facilities. You have the IUCN Red List for threatened species. This basically looks at threatened and endangered species, but many species are listed there. And in India, you have the Indian Biodiversity Portal and many citizen science listings, such as eBird and other listings. So that's it. Thank you from me. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Gopi. Sandhya, thank you for the presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I hope all of you have been looking at the chat box. We've been sharing some links, including for the reporter's manual and the researcher's manual that Gopi just mentioned, and the stories that we have covered as part of this project. Now there are a few questions. So Gopi, we'll take the questions one by one. Marianne has asked, based in Bangalore, where the single-use plastic bottle waste is a massive problem, we have written ad nauseum about it, but as you say, 15 rupees a bottle, it won't stop anytime soon. Single-use plastic is a huge problem, killing of hundreds of birds and animals, both on land and water. A law needs to come in where it is stopped at source, don't you think?
Yeah, Marianne, I mean, that is true. And states have started working on it. Some states more and some states less. For instance, in 2018-19, Tamil Nadu almost banned and regulated the use of single-use plastics. They came to a lot of criticism because of that, but they stuck with it, and the result was quite obvious. I mean, so for a city like Chennai, according to the Corporation of Chennai figures, 5,400 tons of garbage goes into two landfills, one in south and one in northern part of Chennai. Now the point is, if we were to meet tomorrow at this time, you can say anything that you want to say, for, against, what to do, etc. But within this 24 hours, 5,400 tons of garbage would have gone. Now, good amount of it is organic, but also a good amount of it is plastic and plastic related. So if you stop those things at source, at the buying thing, I mean, so if shopkeepers stop giving you that, or you have to pay for it, and people have to be encouraged to move to cloth bags, etc., good amount of this garbage will come down, and I haven't seen data, but because it's been too soon, and but I'm sure people who do work on urban garbage in Chennai would tell you that the quantity has come down, and with it, whole series, because single-use plastic has a disproportionate impact on the environment. It's not like 1 kilo of plastic is equivalent to 1 kilo of rag. I mean, 1 kilo of plastic is equivalent to I don't know how many kilos of rags. So it's got a very disproportionate impact. So it's happening. But what did happen, and you can't blame anybody for it. I mean, this is how history has, or the current contemporary history has taken its root, is the pandemic. And now, I mean, even in it's very difficult to talk about single-use. I mean, talk about regulating single-use plastic at this point of time, when single-use plastic can save people's lives. So I presume this will come back. The discussions will come back, and there will be again a renewed push. And I suppose it's also our responsibility as journalists to give a renewed push once we sort of overcome this pandemic, and then push for it again.
Thanks, Gopi. Another question, though the environmental awareness has increased, there is very little understanding of ecosystem services. It may not be possible to monetize it. How can one sensitize people on this issue?
Yeah, this is very difficult. This is extremely difficult. How do you? What value do you give to your days in childhood, where you were playing cricket next to a lake, or or when you were romancing and you walked into a park or place of what value do you give to that? I mean, you will forget all that. I mean, when you are in a position of power and you're taking a decision where you are, your decision could cost you that very same park or that very same lake, how do you give value to that? I mean, I mean, one argument, and this is where biodiversity people who watch, I mean, who study biodiversity are actually divided. There is one argument is you don't need to give value to this. I mean, that the value is inherent value, and then people have to appreciate that there is an inherent value and conserve the ecosystem services. That's one argument. The other argument is you give an economic value to it, because the people who take decisions can justify their decisions only through an economic value. So you have somebody like you have instances where leaders have taken decision based on strength of conviction. So, for instance, if you read the records of Indira Gandhi's decision on Silent Valley, it was as if she said, "Oh, I like the forest, and I say Silent Valley should not be there." No, she went through a process. She had people who had gone through it, looked at it, but gone beyond all that. And you remember, right? Environmental economics had not grown as much then, 40 years ago. Having reached that point, she took a decision, and then she said, yes, we should conserve Silent Valley. But most of the policymakers do not take decisions like that. Many policymakers do not take decisions like that. So if you go through a process of finding a value, economic value for what is to be conserved, and if you can prove that the economic value for what is to be conserved is more than the economic value of what you will get from destroying it, then it's easier for a policymaker or us, as I said, we as an example. I mean, even for us, if there's a signature somewhere where a decision I take can destroy a park where I would have romanced in the past, or I would have played cricket in the past, still today, I mean, if today I have to take a decision, I mean, if there's an economic argument that supports my hand, then it's easier for me to take that decision, isn't it? So somewhere we have to find value for these ecosystem services. That is what is happening with environmental economics. But it's still a work in progress, because how do you find? I mean, how do you equate value? How do you find? So it's a work in progress, but hopefully over a period of time, I mean, we'll have this getting more and more refined. If you followed the biodiversity discussions going on in the UK right now, Partha Dasgupta, who's an Indian scientist, I mean Indian origin scientist based in Cambridge, St. John's College, Cambridge, and leading light in environmental. He has come out very recently, what they call the Dasgupta report, on this, how to try finding value to some of these. So this is the part of the Teeb report, part of Dasgupta, but these are still work in progress. So more that gets done, hopefully we will even have figures to support our argument. Right now, our argument becomes some airheaded environmentalist argument or some airheaded journalist argument. So we'll have more of that.
Thank you, Gopi. Another question from Yash: how to cover biodiversity without being insensitive to humans affected by conflict, like human-wildlife conflict, intersections of caste, gender, or any other kind of marginalization, right?
Yeah.
How do you cover biodiversity in a sensitive manner?
Yeah. This is a question that we keep coming across. I mean, this is not something in real terms. I mean, as journalist, as an editor, I come across this in real terms all the time. So, for instance, if you check one of the stories which we had recently, where Mohit has done a story on the monkey transportation gone wrong, and monkeys getting killed in Karnataka, rural Karnataka. And you just read that story. I mean, that story does look at at the conflict from people's point of view. I mean, so you can say anything you want to say, but then there is a huge livelihood. I mean, with monkeys may not be life, but livelihood cost involved with people who suffer the conflict through and through. But even more deeper, if you look at a story which we covered quite some time ago, actually, Jaideep Hardikar, a very well-known environment journalist from Central India, Nagpur. Jaideep had done a story because Jaideep lives and did his field work from in the Central Indian tiger belt, and he did a story on how, from the perspective of the people who have been communities who have been affected, who have been sort of killed by tigers, maimed by tigers, etc. I mean, the viewpoint is slightly different. Sharda Balasubramaniam did a story on the man-elephant conflict in the Coimbatore region. So we try to do that. I mean, and it's just a work in progress all the time. I mean, you have to keep looking at it. I mean, it has to be dynamic decision making. How we can incorporate, look at the human, the human element in all this, because it's also as important. I mean, or we did a story on from Shaji. Shaji did a story on the elephant corridor and the human cost in the Nilgiris. So, I mean, most of these issues have multiple dimensions. And as journalists, I mean, if at least we are, even if we are sympathetic or empathetic to all the causes and articulate that, at least we have done half the work. I mean, without being carried over by one or the other side of the argument. Now, how would you do this with caste, gender, and marginalization? Marginalization is I mean, marginalization, it's a truism that anybody, I mean, in any environment, the people who live in the most marginal lands are the most marginalized people. So any story, I mean, like if you're doing a story on watersheds, and how watersheds have improved the life of farmers, in a semi-arid region. There's enough examples in Karnataka or in Maharashtra. And if you're doing a story like that, I mean, a natural instinct would be to go talk with the farmers who have 5 acres of land, 10 acres of land, etc., and who have wells. But we must remember that wells, to dig well, you need capital. And there are farmers in the margins who do not have the capital to dig a well. So, I mean, if you cannot dig a well, you cannot have a benefit of the water that has been conserved because of your check dams and gully plugs, etc. And these are the people who would be the marginal people. These are the good farmers would be the ones who will be living in the bowl, in the center of the bowl. I mean, where the soils are good and water availability is good. The marginal people would be the people living at the edge of, in the upper reaches of the catchment, upper reaches of the watershed, where the soil would have eroded long ago. So they would be the farmers working very poor soil and would still continue to work because they want to work the land, but do not get benefits out of it. So I mean, so the thumb rule for us would be to talk to them, to understand that and understand what their impact and what is the impact of some of the decisions that people in the better part of the catchment have taken. I mean, the decisions they have taken, what impact it has on the marginal, and this will also be the place where the Dalits would stay. This will be the place. I mean, if it's at the edge of a forest, that's where your tribals will stay. So that caste element does get into that. So if you talk to them and bring their argument also into it, then the stories will become richer. For instance, I mean, just to give you a classic example, we've all many of us would have written about Ralegaon Siddhi, which famous because of Anna Hazare's work there. But Anna Hazare I mean, at that point of time, they had stopped grazing. They said there's a ban on grazing. Now, what impact does the ban on grazing have for pastoralists who live on marginal lands? Because for them, they're the only source of income that they have other than the labor they provide, agricultural labor they provide to the farms in the village, or when they migrate out elsewhere, is the goats. And the goats, the moment you sort of tie them up and stall feed them, it's not viable any longer. The goats, if you let them free range, then it's viable. But if there's a ban on free ranging goats, then what impact does it have on their livelihoods? So these are the kind of I think discussions. I mean, these are the kind of reporting that we should look at, and we should sort of try to incorporate into our stories, and that will make it richer. And in terms of women, I mean, the third element you said, gender. The when a river runs dry, it's usually not the men folk who suffer, because the water is fetched by women. So what happens to them? The impact of that. So these are the kind of elements that we have to talk to more people when we do this, so that our stories become richer and deeper. Sandhya?
Thanks, Gopi. So Malaka, I think your question has been answered already. Yeah, okay, that you also said that. Okay, great. So there are two kind of questions on invasive species, which I'm combining into one. Mr. Sundar has said that to conserve biodiversity, he's given Bangalore as an example. And he's saying Bangalore was a barren area 250 years ago, and it was around Tipu's time and later because of British that most flora and fauna was planted in Bangalore, and the flora and fauna there is not indigenous. Correct me if I'm wrong. So that is one kind of question. He's saying if the Western Ghats are like further away from Bangalore, how does the replacing indigenous vegetation with exotic, how does it affect the native biodiversity? And Kanchan Srivastava has the same kind of question. How introduction of exotic species can affect indigenous diversity?
Yeah. Okay. See, to answer Mr. Sundar first, sometimes what we see is within our time frame. No, I mean, not sometimes, almost all the time, and we do not see what was there before. So in Bengaluru's case, I'm sure because when the Britishers came, this is the same with Nilgiris, and I can give you the example of, I can run you through what happened in the Nilgiris after the Britishers came. But in Bengaluru, I'm sure a good amount of flora and fauna would have come after the Britishers moved in, and they moved in the flora and fauna. But that does not mean, Bangalore is semi-arid. Bangalore doesn't, I don't think Bangalore even receives the annual rainfall that Chennai receives. So it is a semi-arid region, and it's a rocky terrain. So it obviously did not support the kind of biological diversity it supports now. That much of it has come from later times. Okay, but the point is, having said that, we cannot say that Bangalore didn't have its own native biodiversity. Bangalore had its native biodiversity, which would have been in tune with the surroundings, and that's how people also would have lived in tune with that native biodiversity. So if one of the stories we reported on the native food cropping system and millets, and that would have been in tune with that. So that what happens is it gets written over so drastically after some time that you don't even know what the native is. Now the question is, if we were to conserve biological diversity in Bangalore, do we conserve present day biodiversity, or do we conserve biodiversity of the past? And is it even possible to conserve biodiversity of past? And what is the biodiversity of the past? I mean, see, these are the questions. So I mean, the point is, I mean, we start by conserving what we have, and and try to bias our conservation action in such a way that more and more native species are conserved. Whether it will go back to the past, certainly not. I mean, certainly not. But at least we can ensure that the ecosystem services that we have today can be conserved, or maybe enhanced. Just to run the parallel for you, because this on Nilgiris I know better. I can tell you. I mean, see the Nilgiris, the upper plateau. I mean, there are historical records of the Todas. Pink Todas are pastoralists, and they have been there for at least 1 millennium, maybe more. 1 to 2 millennia. And the other communities were there. The Badagas came from north, and north meaning plateau, Mysore plateau area, and they have moved in post 1565, the Battle of Talikota, and post in different fluxes, different waves they moved in. But the British came to the Nilgiris upper plateau in 1821, and it's after that there was this sea change in the biodiversity of planted crops, etc. Because they brought in, when the British moved in, they realized, oh, there's a place, there's a island, Sky Island, which reminds us of England. So let's grow all the crops that grow in England. So that's how they started the crops that you see, the horticultural crops like or your cabbage, cauliflower, etc., carrots, etc., and also the plantation crops. That, I mean, tea was certainly not drunk in India before the British, and coffee, tree coffee, all that came post 1850. So then the biodiversity has changed. So now, and over a period of time, the grasslands have been overgrown with eucalyptus, acacia, etc. So now what happens is, can you go back to it? I mean, it's almost impossible. I mean, you can't remove these eucalyptus and acacia plants. I mean, there are well-meaning judges in the Tamil Nadu High Court who said we should remove these invasives, but then you make an effort, they'll come back the next year. So you're just wasting your time and energy on that. So, but at least if things can be preserved so that it doesn't get worse, maybe a step is made. At least that then the current day ecosystem services can be maintained, and the current day natural resources can be maintained. Yeah.
Thank you, Gopi. And I think we're almost at 12, but if everyone has the time, we can take one more question. Smruti is asking about, she says she has some experience writing on urban news for more than 2 decades. Urban land, in fact, all urban resources are seen as capital and have to be turned into monetized assets according to those in power. It's very difficult to convince, say, the chief minister or municipal commissioner otherwise. One look at the Mumbai development plan for 2034 makes it clear that land use and land zoning dominates urban planning. Your views on this?
Yeah. Smriti Kopikar is being very, very modest by saying she has some experience in reporting. Smriti is one of the very senior environment journalists, and she was chief of bureau of Outlook in Outlook in Mumbai, and very, very senior journalist and an old friend. So Smriti, stop being modest to start with, and let me try answering your question. I hope I meet your standards. Okay. Now the point is, this is true. I mean, in Kerala, and I'm not even going to an urban land where land is even more highly priced than in rural, semi-rural setting. I was trying to look at mangroves in Kerala, and Kerala, you would think that Kerala is a state which will have a lot of mangroves. But it's not true. I mean, when you get onto the ground, you realize Kerala doesn't have too much of mangroves, and what is there is a vestige of what was there. For a state which has had so much, has such a wide network of estuaries. I mean, so where mixing of tidal waters happen, you should be seeing far more amount of mangroves. So Kerala currently has, I mean, the state has currently has 17 to 20, I mean, various estimates between 17 to 25 square kilometers of mangroves. Realistically, it's around 21 square kilometers of mangroves. Okay. Now, the greater Mumbai city, the larger area, larger urban agglomeration, used to have 75 square kilometers. So where is 21 square kilometers? Where is 75 square kilometers? Used to have 75 square kilometers of mangroves. Today, it is estimated to be 68 square kilometers of mangroves, but still, it is far bigger than the state of Kerala and very rich and very spread out for a city like Mumbai. Okay. Now to go to the pressure in Kerala, the land pressure in Kerala. Now, more than 2/3 of this 21 square kilometers, more than 2/3 of this 21 square kilometers is under private ownership. Okay. Now, if let us assume I live in Kerala, so let us assume my father didn't do me that, didn't give me land with mangroves, but let us assume my father gave me 1 acre of land in which 75% is mangroves. What would be my interest? To monetize the mangrove? I mean, it's a private ownership, so nobody can stop me from, I mean, you can say you're being non-environmental, you're being non-green, etc. But nobody can stop me from cutting that mangroves and selling it off as plot of land. When land is so so, I mean, what money I can get from selling off that, perhaps I can live my entire life without having to be employed. And instead, would you expect me to sort of conserve that mangrove? So that is the kind of trade-off that an individual would face in a semi-rural or a semi-urban setting like Kerala. Now, you move that same argument to Mumbai. It's a totally different dynamic. So I mean, in a city where where almost everything has to fit in that small peninsula, and then what is above that peninsula and what is on this side of that peninsula, and so much is happening. How do you fight off the pressures to maintain, to keep the sanctity of that 68 square kilometers, plus the mud flats, plus the tidal creeks, etc., etc.? I mean, it's very difficult. So it's very difficult for a policymaker to see reason to conserve it. So what can we do? I mean, point is, whenever these events happen, we can build these stories back. I mean, see, you did. If we didn't have those mangroves, I mean, maybe these floods would have been far worse. I mean, we would have lost far more lives. So those kind of loops are what we can build. We can, and as the process of finding economic value for some of these ecosystems improve, we can keep telling those stories. I mean, that's all. I mean, what we can do as media is continue working, plugging at it over time, and hopefully it will help in the larger picture. I mean, this trade-off is the stakes are too high for somebody to take a decision that I will conserve. So for somebody to be brave enough to justify that, it becomes difficult. So we can try and help anybody who is well-meaning in sort of help their hands. RA, for instance, was the classic example where these things came into all the forces came into play with the metro car shed project. So I mean, so somebody could communicate, or over a period of time, people could communicate. So I mean, we'll see these small battles or these battles all through, all along, and let's continue doing what we're doing. That's all we can do.
Thank you, Gopi. I think that's also a very good note for us to wrap up this session. Thank you all again for joining us today. And if you just go over to our chat box, you'll see the links to our social platforms. You can follow us on any platform of your choice, or you can sign up to our weekly newsletter. That link is also given. And as most of you know, we do stories on environment conservation and clean energy and energy transitions. Again, thank you. Thank you from all of us at Mongo Bay India.